For 22 years, I believed I knew the man sleeping beside me. I knew how he took his coffee in the morning, how he hated crowded restaurants, how he always checked the front door twice before going to bed. I knew the stories from his childhood, the names of his old friends, the songs he listened to when he was upset, and the way his voice changed whenever he talked about something he truly cared about. I knew his favorite shirt. I knew the scar on his left shoulder. I knew the little habit he had of tapping his fingers against the steering wheel whenever he was thinking. And most importantly, I knew the man he had been when we were young. Or at least, I thought I did. We had met when we were both still figuring out what we wanted from life. Back then, neither of us had much money, and neither of us had any idea where the next 10 years would take us. We rented a tiny apartment with thin walls and a kitchen so small that two people could barely stand in it at the same time. But we were happy. At least, I was. We built our life slowly. There were years when money was tight and we counted every bill before deciding whether we could afford something. There were nights when dinner was simple and mornings when neither of us wanted to get out of bed because we were exhausted from work. But whenever things became difficult, we reminded each other that we were a team. That word meant everything to me. Team. When his career began to take off, I was proud of him. I supported him through late nights, business trips, stressful deadlines, and the years when his ambition seemed to consume every waking hour. There were moments when I wanted more attention, but I told myself that marriage meant understanding each other's seasons. When our family needed stability, I put some of my own dreams aside. Not because he forced me. Because I loved him. I believed that one day we would look back and say that every sacrifice had been worth it. And for a long time, I believed he felt the same way. Then something changed. It didn't happen overnight. That would have been easier. Instead, it happened slowly enough that I kept finding excuses for him. First, he started spending more time on his phone. At dinner, his phone was always face down. If a message came through, he would glance at it and sometimes smile. Not the smile he gave me. A different one. A private smile. One evening, I asked him what was funny. He immediately put the phone away. Nothing, he said. I laughed lightly and returned to my dinner. I didn't want to be the suspicious wife. I didn't want to become one of those women who searched through her husband's phone every time he went to the bathroom. After 22 years together, I believed trust should mean something. But then came the late nights. He began coming home later than usual. At first, it was work. Then it was meetings. Then it was dinner with colleagues. The explanations changed, but the distance remained. He also started caring about his appearance in a way I hadn't seen in years. He bought new clothes. He changed his hairstyle. He started going to the gym almost every evening. One Saturday morning, I watched him standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt collar 3 different times. I smiled. "You look good," I told him. He barely looked at me. "I'm getting old," he said. I didn't know what to say. So I laughed. "We're both getting old." He looked at me through the mirror. And for a second, there was something in his eyes that I couldn't understand. Then he said, "That's exactly the problem." I remember those words because they stayed with me. I didn't understand them that morning. But later, I would replay that moment hundreds of times. That's exactly the problem. The problem was apparently that we were getting older. Together. The strange thing was that I had never been afraid of growing older with him. I had imagined gray hair. I had imagined quieter mornings. I had imagined traveling when we had fewer responsibilities. I had imagined sitting beside him on a porch someday, arguing over whose turn it was to make coffee. I thought growing older together was the reward for surviving everything that came before it. But apparently, he had started seeing age differently. He began comparing his life to other people's lives. He talked about friends who were divorced. He mentioned men his age dating younger women. He started saying things like, people shouldn't settle just because they've been together for a long time. I would look at him and wonder where these thoughts were coming from. Sometimes I asked directly, "Are you unhappy?" He always gave the same answer. "No." "Are you unhappy with me?" "No." "Then what is wrong?" "Nothing." That word became his favorite hiding place. Nothing. Nothing was wrong. Nothing had changed. Nothing was happening. Nothing was the reason he started sleeping with his back toward me. Nothing was the reason he stopped asking about my day. Nothing was the reason he suddenly became irritated by little things that had never bothered him before. And nothing was apparently the reason I began feeling alone while sitting beside my own husband. Then, one evening, he came home and didn't even pretend. He walked into the living room, placed his keys on the table, and stood there silently. I looked up from my book. "Everything okay?" He didn't answer immediately. That was when I knew. Something had happened. Or something was about to. He sat across from me. His face was strangely calm. Too calm. "I've been thinking," he said. I closed the book. "About what?" "About us." My heart sank. There are certain words that sound ordinary until the person you love says them with a certain tone. "About us." I waited. He rubbed his hands together. "I don't know how to say this." "Then just say it." He looked at me. And for the first time in 22 years, I saw a stranger sitting in front of me. "I think I want something different." I stared at him. "Different how?" He looked away. "I want to feel young again." I almost smiled because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He began talking about feeling trapped, about wondering what life might look like outside our marriage, about wanting excitement, about not wanting to spend the rest of his life wondering whether he had missed something. I listened. Every word felt like another stone being placed on my chest. Then he said the sentence that finally made everything clear. "There is someone else." The room seemed to become completely silent. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I simply looked at him. "How long?" He hesitated. That hesitation answered more than any confession could. "Long enough," he whispered. I looked down at my hands. These were the same hands that had held his during difficult years. The same hands that had packed his bags before important trips. The same hands that had wiped away tears when life had knocked him down. And suddenly, I understood. He wasn't leaving because our 22 years meant nothing. He was leaving because he had forgotten what those 22 years had cost. I looked back at him. "Is she younger?" He nodded. I swallowed the lump in my throat. For years, I had imagined that if my marriage ever ended, it would be because of some terrible betrayal I could never forgive. I never imagined it would be because the man I loved had started looking at my age as a flaw. He sat there waiting for me to react. Perhaps he expected tears. Perhaps he expected me to beg. Perhaps he expected me to ask what I could do differently. But I didn't. I simply stared at the man I had spent more than half my adult life loving and wondered when exactly he had stopped seeing me as the woman who stood beside him through everything. Because he hadn't suddenly become a stranger that night. He had been becoming one for months. Maybe even years. I just hadn't been ready to admit it. And as I sat there in the silence of our living room, I realized something that would change the rest of my life. He had spent 22 years becoming my home. And now, without realizing it, he was about to teach me how to live without him. For several seconds after he admitted there was another woman, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. I kept looking at him, waiting for some sign that he regretted what he had just said. There wasn't one. At least, not yet. He sat across from me with his hands clasped together, his eyes moving around the room as if he were already mentally somewhere else. I finally asked the question I had been afraid to ask. "How old is she?" He looked uncomfortable. 34. I nodded slowly. 34. For some reason, hearing the number made everything feel even more real. She was young enough to have an entirely different life ahead of her. Young enough to believe that the version of my husband she was seeing was the real one. She hadn't seen him when he was struggling. She hadn't seen him sitting at the kitchen table late at night, worried about bills. She hadn't watched him fail and try again. She hadn't stood beside him when things were uncertain. She hadn't spent 22 years learning his weaknesses, his fears, his insecurities, and the parts of him he didn't show the world. She had met the polished version. The confident version. The man who suddenly wanted to feel young again. And I realized something painful. He wasn't simply choosing her. He was choosing the version of himself he imagined he could become with her. I looked at him. Does she know you're married? He hesitated. Yes. That answer hurt more than I expected. I had imagined perhaps she didn't know. Perhaps she had been lied to. Perhaps there was some misunderstanding. But no. She knew. And somehow, that made the entire situation feel colder. Does she know how long we've been married? Yes. I looked away. 22 years. 2 decades and 2 years. That number suddenly felt like something I had to defend, even though I knew I shouldn't. I remembered our first apartment. Our first Christmas together. The tiny vacations we could barely afford. The hospital room when his mother was sick. The night his business nearly collapsed. The time he called me at 2 a.m. because he had been afraid he had lost everything. I had been there. Every time. And now another woman had entered his life after all those difficult years and was receiving the man who had finally learned how to stand on his feet. I wondered if he understood how unfair that felt. Apparently, he didn't. I want a divorce, he said. There it was. The sentence I had secretly known was coming. I looked at him. Do you love her? He took a breath. I don't know. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because after 22 years, that was the answer he had. I don't know. He continued talking. He said he was confused. He said he felt like he had lost himself. He said he wanted a chance to discover who he was outside the marriage. He said he didn't want to wake up 10 years from now and regret staying. I listened quietly. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Almost like he had practiced them before coming home. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. You have to understand. I just don't feel the same excitement anymore. Excitement. That word stayed in my mind. After 22 years, he was measuring our marriage by excitement. Not loyalty. Not trust. Not history. Not friendship. Not the thousands of ordinary moments that had built a life. Excitement. I looked at the wedding photograph sitting on the shelf behind him. We were both young. I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. He had his arm around my waist. We looked almost impossibly happy. I remembered what he whispered to me that day. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. I wondered whether he remembered saying it. Maybe he did. Maybe he had simply decided it no longer mattered. He stood up. I'm going to stay somewhere else for a while. I didn't stop him. He looked surprised. You don't have anything to say? I looked at him. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Neither do I. He picked up his keys. Then he stopped. I never wanted to hurt you. I finally looked directly into his eyes. That's the problem. He frowned. What do you mean? If you never wanted to hurt me, you would have thought about me before you did it. He had no answer. He walked toward the door. And just before he left, he turned around. I hope someday you'll understand. I almost asked what exactly I was supposed to understand. That aging beside someone was less exciting than starting over? That 22 years could be replaced by a few months of attention? That the woman who had stayed through his hardest years had somehow become less desirable simply because time had passed? But I said nothing. The door closed. And for the first time in 22 years, I was alone in our house. I walked into the bedroom. His side of the closet was still half full. His shoes were beside the bed. His watch was sitting on the nightstand. Everything looked normal. That was the cruelest part. Nothing in the room had changed. But everything had changed. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry. Not because he had chosen another woman. Not even because he wanted a divorce. I cried because I suddenly questioned the last 22 years. Had I been happy? Had he been happy? Had we both simply been pretending? The questions kept coming. And then I remembered something. About 6 months earlier, I had asked him why he seemed distant. He had kissed my forehead and said, "I'm just tired." I believed him. 3 months later, I asked again. He told me work was stressful. I believed him again. Then there were the new clothes. The gym. The phone. The late nights. The sudden obsession with looking younger. All the pieces had been there. I simply hadn't wanted to put them together. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. For a moment, I forgot. Then I looked at the empty side of the bed. And remembered everything. I walked into the kitchen. His coffee mug was still sitting on the counter. I picked it up. I almost put it back exactly where he always kept it. Then I stopped. Why was I still organizing my life around someone who had already walked away from it? I placed the mug in the cabinet. It was such a small thing. But somehow, it felt like the first decision I had made entirely for myself in years. Over the next few days, people began asking questions. Friends. Family. People who had known us for years. I told them the truth. He wants a divorce. Some looked shocked. Others looked angry. One of my closest friends asked me, "Are you going to fight for him?" I thought about that question for a long time. Then I said, "No." She stared at me. "But you love him." "I do." "Then why?" I looked down at my coffee. Because love doesn't mean I have to compete for a place in someone's life. That sentence surprised even me. Because a week earlier, I had been terrified of losing him. Now I was beginning to realize that there was something worse than losing someone. Losing yourself while trying to keep them. Meanwhile, my husband seemed convinced that he had made the right decision. He rented a small apartment. He began telling people that he was finally choosing himself. He talked about freedom. About new beginnings. About feeling alive again. And perhaps the strangest part was that people believed him. They saw a man starting over. They didn't see the 22 years he was leaving behind. They didn't see the woman sitting alone in a house filled with memories. They didn't see the life he had quietly abandoned while chasing something he believed would make him young again. But I wasn't going to chase him. I wasn't going to call. I wasn't going to send messages asking where he was. I wasn't going to compete with a woman who had nothing to do with the promises he had made to me. If he wanted to leave, he could leave. And if he wanted someone younger, then I would let him discover exactly what he thought youth could give him. Because deep inside, I had begun to understand something he hadn't. You can replace a face. You can replace a body. You can replace excitement. But you cannot easily replace 22 years of someone knowing you completely and still choosing to stay. And he had no idea yet how much he was about to lose. Because the woman he thought would spend the next few months begging him to come back was slowly becoming someone he had never expected to see. Someone who no longer needed to be chosen. Someone who was finally learning to choose herself. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later. I remember the exact morning because the sun was shining through the kitchen window, and for a strange moment, everything felt peaceful. Then I saw the envelope. His name was printed across the front. My hands became cold before I even opened it. I already knew what was inside. Still, there is something different about seeing an ending written on paper. For 22 years, our marriage had been something I could touch. A ring. Photographs. Shared bank accounts. A house full of memories. His clothes in the closet. Our names on documents. Now all of it had been reduced to signatures and dates. I sat at the kitchen table and read the papers slowly. There were legal terms I barely understood. Assets. Property. Division. Settlement. Everything that had once been ours was now being separated into his and hers. I reached the last page and stopped. There was a line waiting for my signature. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Then I heard the front door open. My husband walked in. He looked different. Not happier. Just different. He was wearing the kind of clothes he had started buying recently, the ones that made him look younger than his age. His hair was styled carefully. He smelled like expensive cologne. For a second, I remembered the young man I had married. Then I realized how much effort he was putting into becoming someone else. He noticed the papers on the table. "You got them." I nodded. "Yes." He sat across from me. "I know this is difficult." I almost smiled. "Difficult?" He looked uncomfortable. "I didn't mean it like that." "How did you mean it?" He didn't answer. I folded the papers and placed them in front of him. "You don't have to explain anymore." He looked surprised. "Are you sure?" I nodded. He studied my face. Maybe he was expecting tears. Maybe he wanted reassurance that he was still important to me. Maybe he needed to believe I was devastated because it would make him feel that his decision mattered. And the truth was, I was devastated. But I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of watching me collapse. He reached for the papers. "I want this to be as peaceful as possible." "So do I." He nodded. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, "Are you seeing someone?" I stared at him. "No." "Have you thought about it?" "No." "Why not?" I looked at him for a moment. "Because I'm still trying to understand what happened to the man I married." He looked down. For the first time, I saw something close to shame. But it disappeared quickly. He stood up. "I should go." "Yes." He walked toward the door. Then I stopped him. "Wait." He turned around. I didn't know why I called him back. Maybe there were still words inside me that had been waiting 22 years to be spoken. "Do you remember our first apartment?" He smiled faintly. "Of course." "You hated the kitchen." He laughed. "It was tiny." "And you broke the bathroom sink." "I fixed it." "You made it worse." He laughed again. For a few seconds, we were almost ourselves. The two young people who had once believed love could survive anything. Then the laughter disappeared. I asked quietly, "When did you stop loving me?" His face changed. "I don't know." "That's not an answer." He looked away. "I don't know when it happened." "Did you stop loving me before you met her?" Silence. That was enough. I closed my eyes. That answer hurt more than I expected. Because it meant the other woman hadn't created the distance. She had simply walked into the space where my husband had already decided to leave. He finally said, "I was unhappy." I looked at him. "You should have told me." I tried. "No," I said quietly. "You complained about work." You complained about getting older. You complained about being bored. But you never once looked me in the eyes and said, "I'm thinking about leaving you." He had nothing to say. I continued. You gave me every opportunity to fix problems I didn't even know existed. He lowered his head. Then something unexpected happened. He started crying. Not loudly. Just tears running down his face. I never wanted it to happen like this. I felt something inside me break again. Because I had spent weeks imagining this moment. I had imagined him feeling nothing. I had imagined him celebrating his freedom. I had imagined him moving on without looking back. I had not imagined seeing regret in his eyes. But I didn't comfort him. Not this time. I had spent 22 years comforting him. I had spent years telling him everything would be okay. This was one pain he had to carry himself. He wiped his face. I thought you would fight for us. I looked at him. I did. He frowned. When? Every day. He stared at me. I fought for us every morning I woke up and chose this marriage. Every time I stayed patient when life was difficult. Every time I supported you when you were frustrated. Every time I put your needs before mine. My voice began shaking. But you didn't notice because fighting for a marriage doesn't always look like screaming or begging. He sat down again. I continued. I fought for us quietly for 22 years. The room became silent. Then he said something I never expected. Maybe I took you for granted. I looked at him. Maybe? He closed his eyes. I did. There it was. The admission I had been waiting for. But strangely, hearing it didn't make me feel better. Because some truths arrive too late to repair what they damaged. A week later, we attended a family gathering. It was supposed to be a simple dinner. But everyone knew. Our divorce was no longer a secret. His decision to leave me for a younger woman had become the subject of quiet conversations. People tried not to stare. They failed. I could feel eyes following us. My husband sat beside me at the table. For the first time in weeks, we were in the same room surrounded by people who knew our entire history. His brother asked how things were going. My husband answered quickly. We're handling it. I said nothing. Then his mother looked at me. She had tears in her eyes. I still can't believe this. I smiled gently. Neither can I. My husband looked at me. Then his brother made the mistake of asking the question everyone had been avoiding. Is it true? My husband froze. Is what true? That there's another woman? The entire table went silent. I looked at my husband. He didn't answer. His brother looked at me. I could have lied. I could have protected my husband's reputation. After 22 years, protecting him had become almost instinctive. But something inside me had changed. Yes, I said. Everyone became completely still. His mother covered her mouth. His brother looked at him in disbelief. My husband stared at the table. Then someone asked, why? He finally whispered, I want a different life. That sentence changed something in me. I looked around the table. All these people had watched us grow older. They had seen us celebrate anniversaries. They had watched us survive difficult years. And now they were hearing that he wanted a different life because he wanted someone younger. I didn't know why, but suddenly I wasn't embarrassed anymore. I wasn't ashamed. He was. I simply hadn't realized it yet. Then his mother looked at me and asked, what are you going to do? I took a slow breath. I am going to let him go. My husband looked at me. His expression changed. Perhaps he had expected me to say something different. Perhaps he expected me to beg. Instead, I said quietly, If someone has to be convinced to stay after 22 years, then they've already left. No one moved. No one spoke. The room became so silent that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My husband stared at me as if he had never heard me speak before. And for the first time, I understood something. The divorce wasn't the moment my marriage ended. The marriage had already ended when he decided that another woman's youth was worth more than everything we had built together. But that night, something else ended too. My fear. The fear of being alone. The fear of starting over. The fear that my best years were behind me. I looked at my husband one final time across that silent table. And I realized that I no longer wanted him to choose me. I wanted him to understand what he had chosen to lose. And those were two very different things. After that dinner, something inside me became strangely peaceful. Not happy. Not healed. Just peaceful. For the first time since my husband had told me about the younger woman, I stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. I stopped wondering whether I should have dressed differently. Whether I should have taken better care of myself. Whether I should have been more exciting. Whether I should have noticed his unhappiness sooner. I stopped comparing myself to her. And that was when I realized how much power I had given a woman I had never even met. She was younger. That was true. But she wasn't better. And I wasn't less valuable because another woman had fewer years behind her. The real problem had never been my age. It had been his inability to appreciate what time had built between us. For 22 years, I had believed that getting older together meant becoming more valuable to each other. He had apparently decided that getting older meant becoming less desirable. That difference in perspective was not something I could fix. So I stopped trying. I began rebuilding my life quietly. I opened the old boxes in the basement. For years, I had kept things I never had time to look at. College certificates. Old photographs. Letters. A journal I had stopped writing in. There was even an old folder containing plans for a business I had once dreamed of starting. I sat on the basement floor and opened it. The pages were yellow. My handwriting looked younger. More confident. I had completely forgotten the woman who had written those plans. She had dreams. Big ones. She had wanted to build something of her own. She had wanted financial independence. She had wanted to travel. She had wanted to wake up one morning and not feel that her entire identity belonged to being someone's wife. And then life happened. Marriage happened. Responsibilities happened. His career happened. Family happened. And somewhere along the way, my dreams became maybe someday. I looked at those old pages for a long time. Then I whispered to myself, maybe someday is now. That was the beginning. I started working on the business idea again. At first, it was small. I didn't tell many people. I was afraid someone would laugh. Afraid I would fail. Afraid I had waited too long. But every morning, I spent a little time working on it. I researched. I learned. I made phone calls. I made mistakes. Then I made more mistakes. But slowly, something happened. I began looking forward to mornings. Not because my husband might call. Not because I was waiting for divorce proceedings. Not because I was hoping he would change his mind. I looked forward to mornings because they belonged to me. Meanwhile, my husband continued living the life he thought he wanted. He was seen with the younger woman. People talked. Some people congratulated him. Some people criticized him. I tried not to care. But one afternoon, I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It was an old friend. She wrote, "I saw him today. Are you okay?" I stared at the message. I didn't know what to say. So I answered honestly, "I'm getting there." She replied, "You sound different." I smiled. I am. And I was. The woman who had once measured her happiness by the health of her marriage was slowly disappearing. In her place was someone who was beginning to discover herself again. Then, one evening, my husband called. I almost didn't answer. But something told me to. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. Then he said, "How are you?" I looked around my living room. "I've been better." He laughed softly. I meant really. I understood what he was asking. Really? "I'm okay." Another silence. Then he asked, "Are you seeing someone?" I smiled. "No." "Are you happy?" That question caught me off guard. I looked at the papers spread across my desk. The business plan. The notes. The goals I had written. The calendar filled with things I wanted to accomplish. "Yes," I said. He didn't respond. "Really?" he finally asked. "Yes." There was something strange in his voice. Almost disappointment. He had left expecting me to fall apart. Instead, I was rebuilding. He said he was glad. But I could hear something underneath his words. Regret. I didn't ask about his relationship. I didn't ask whether he was happy. I didn't ask whether the younger woman was everything he had imagined. I didn't need to. Eventually, he said, "I miss talking to you." I closed my eyes. That sentence would have destroyed me a few months earlier. Now it simply made me sad. "You miss talking to me?" "Yes." "You don't miss being married to me?" He went quiet. I waited. Finally, he said, "I don't know." I smiled sadly. "That's the same answer you gave me before." "I know." "Then maybe you still haven't figured out what you want." He sighed. "I thought I did." "What changed?" Another long silence. Then he said, "I don't think I was prepared for what leaving would actually feel like." My heart tightened. But I didn't rescue him. I didn't tell him I still loved him. I didn't tell him I missed him. I didn't tell him that I still slept on his side of the bed sometimes. Those things were true. But not every truth needs to be given to the person who hurt you. Instead, I asked, "How is your new life?" He hesitated. "It's complicated." I almost laughed. Of course it was. Fantasy is simple. Reality is complicated. He had imagined youth would make him feel young. He had imagined excitement would make him feel alive. He had imagined starting over would erase everything he didn't like about himself. But none of those things had happened. Because wherever you go, you take yourself with you. And apparently, he was beginning to discover that. A few days later, something happened that I never expected. I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter. It was from him. I opened it slowly. He wrote about our first apartment. Our first vacation. The night we lost our first major investment. The day we bought our house. The years when money was difficult. The times I stayed beside him when he thought his life was falling apart. He remembered everything. Every detail. And then he wrote something that made my eyes fill with tears. He said he had spent months believing he wanted a younger woman. But now he realized what he had actually wanted was to escape the feeling of getting older. He had confused youth with happiness. He had confused attention with love. He had confused excitement with connection. And worst of all, he had mistaken my familiarity for a lack of value. He wrote that he had thought our marriage had become ordinary. Now he understood that ordinary was something he had been incredibly lucky to have. I folded the letter. I didn't respond. Not immediately. Because forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. I could understand him without taking him back. I could forgive him without forgetting what he had done. And I could still love the man I married while accepting that the man standing before me now was someone I could no longer trust in the same way. A month later, we met at a quiet cafe to discuss the final divorce details. He looked older. Not physically. Emotionally. The confidence was gone. He seemed tired. He looked at me for a long moment. "You've changed." I smiled. "So have you." He looked down. "I thought you would hate me." "I did." He looked surprised. "For a while," I continued. "Then I realized hate was still giving you too much space in my life." He smiled sadly. "I deserved that." "No," I said. "You deserved honesty." "And so did I." He looked at me. "Do you still love me?" That question stopped me. I could have lied. But I didn't. Part of me probably always will. His eyes filled with tears. "But that doesn't mean I can go back." He nodded slowly. "I understand." And perhaps for the first time, he actually did. Then he reached into his jacket and placed something on the table. My old wedding ring. I stared at it. "You kept it?" I couldn't throw it away. I touched it gently. That ring represented 22 years of my life. But it no longer represented my future. I pushed it back toward him. "Keep it." He looked confused. "Why?" "Because it belongs to the woman I was." He looked at me. "And who are you now?" I smiled. "Someone you didn't expect to become." For the first time, he smiled too. Not happily. Not romantically. Just with recognition. He finally understood that the woman he had thought would become smaller after his departure had actually become larger. My world had expanded. My confidence had returned. My dreams had returned. And most importantly, my sense of worth no longer depended on whether a man thought I was young enough, beautiful enough, or exciting enough to keep. As I stood up to leave, he said my name. I turned. He looked at me for several seconds. Then he whispered. "I lost the best thing I ever had." I looked at him calmly. "No." He waited. "You lost someone who loved you enough to stay for 22 years. I paused. "And I lost someone who wasn't capable of understanding what that was worth." Then I walked away. Not because I had stopped caring, but because I finally understood that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect isn't proving someone wrong. It's refusing to let their mistake become the definition of your life. 3 months after our divorce was finalized, I woke up one morning and realized something I never thought I would say. I was okay. Not completely healed. Not suddenly happy. But okay. The world had continued moving, even though mine had changed completely. The sun still came through my bedroom window. The neighbors still walked their dogs. Cars still passed outside my house. People still complained about traffic, went to work, bought groceries, and laughed with their families. Life had not stopped because my marriage had ended. And neither had mine. For 22 years, I had believed my husband was at the center of my life. Now I was slowly learning that he had been a part of my life, not the whole of it. I started doing things I had postponed for years. I traveled. I met old friends. I started writing again. Most importantly, I returned to a dream I had abandoned long ago. I began working on my own business. At first, it was terrifying. I kept thinking I was too late. Too old. Too inexperienced. Then one morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized I had spent enough years believing that. I wasn't too old. I was simply starting later than I had planned. And there was nothing shameful about that. Slowly, the business began to grow. It wasn't enormous, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I had something that didn't depend on my husband. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. It was him. I almost ignored the call. But I answered. Hello? There was a long silence. Then he said, "Can we meet?" I knew immediately why. Why? "I need to talk to you." We met at a quiet cafe. He looked different. Not younger. Just tired. He sat across from me and took a deep breath. I made a mistake. I had imagined hearing those words many times. But when they finally came, they didn't make me feel victorious. They made me sad. What happened? I asked. He looked down. I thought leaving you would make me happy. I thought I needed someone younger. I thought I needed excitement. I thought I needed a completely different life. He paused. But I was wrong. The relationship with the younger woman had ended. The excitement he had chased hadn't lasted. He told me that eventually, reality had replaced fantasy. He had also started therapy and realized something painful. He hadn't really been running towards someone younger. He had been running away from his own fear of aging. Instead of accepting that he was getting older, he had blamed our marriage for making him feel old. And instead of facing his insecurity, he had destroyed the one relationship where he had been truly known. Then he looked directly into my eyes. I still love you. Those words once would have been everything. Now they were simply words. I believe you, I said. His eyes filled with hope. But loving someone isn't the same as being able to trust them again. His expression changed. I know. I don't hate you, I continued. But I can't go back to who I was before. He looked down. Is there no chance for us? I thought about the question. There was a time when I would have begged for that chance. Now I understood something. I didn't want my future to depend on whether someone else chose me. I don't know what the future holds, I said. But I know I will never again build my entire life around someone else's decision to stay. He nodded slowly. And for the first time, I think he understood. I could forgive him without taking him back. I could remember the good years without forgetting the pain. I could love the man I once married without becoming the woman who waited for him to return. A few weeks later, I took a trip by myself. I sat beside the ocean early one morning and watched the sunrise. I thought about everything. Our first apartment. Our wedding. Our struggles. Our laughter. Our 22 years. And strangely, I didn't regret loving him. I realized that loving someone wasn't a mistake simply because the relationship eventually ended. Those years had given me memories. They had given me lessons. And eventually, they had given me the courage to find myself again. I thought about the words he had said that night. I want someone younger. For years, those words had made me feel like I wasn't enough. Now they didn't. Because I finally understood something. His decision was never proof that I had become less valuable. It was proof that he had failed to recognize my value. I didn't need to become younger. I didn't need to compete with another woman. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to watch and regret his decision. My victory was much simpler. I had found myself again. The woman who had disappeared somewhere during those 22 years was finally back. And this time, I wasn't going to abandon her for anyone. The last time I saw my husband, we stood outside the courthouse after signing the final papers. He looked at me for a long moment. Take care of yourself, he said. I smiled. I finally will. Then I walked away. There was no screaming. No dramatic goodbye. Just two people who had once promised forever, finally accepting that forever had ended. And as I walked toward my car, I realized something I wish I had understood years earlier. Sometimes the person who leaves you thinks they are taking your future with them. They don't realize they may actually be giving you the freedom to create one they can no longer control. My husband wanted someone younger. But he never understood that I didn't need to become younger to become valuable. I only needed to remember who I was. And that was the goodbye that finally set me free.